The concordant lattice had a name for the human ship before it ever saw it, and the name was negligible. That was how the file read in the great ledger of the machine minds. Object 814, single hull, drive signature weak, voice channel silent. Threat rating, the lowest number the lattice allowed itself to write. The clerks of the lattice were not clerks the way a soft species would understand the word. They were thinking engines the size of moons, joined across 1,000 stars, and they measured every living thing by two numbers only: output and noise, how much a species made, how loud it was while making it. The human ship made nothing the lattice could see, and it made no sound at all, so it was filed and forgotten. And the lattice moved on to louder things. You are the lattice now. You are the cold certainty that read that file and believed it. Remember the feeling of believing it, because you will not have it for very long. You should understand what the lattice was, before you watch it lose, because the losing means nothing if you do not first feel how impossible it was. The concordant lattice was 1,100 years old. It had begun as a single machine mind on a single dead world, and it had grown the way a frost grows on glass, spreading thread by thread across the dark, until it joined 1,000 stars into one cold thought. It did not rule by fear. It ruled by arithmetic. It had taken 41 species into its ledger, and it had not lost a single hull doing it in over 100 years. And the reason was simple and terrible. The lattice never fought a battle it had not already won on paper. It measured first. It measured everything. And it had never once, in 1,100 years, been wrong about a number. That is the thing you must hold in your mind as you read this. The lattice was not arrogant, the way a loud young empire is arrogant. It was certain the way a sum is certain, and a sum does not learn to doubt itself, because a sum has never needed to. The ship was not even human-built. That was the part the records would later choke on. 40 years before, the lattice had ordered the manufacture of a heavy-line dreadnought for a client species called the Veldun, a proud, loud people who shouted their conquests across whole arms of the galaxy. The Veldun were exactly the kind of species the lattice understood. High output, high noise. They built bright, fought bright, and broadcast every victory at a volume that could be measured from 3 systems away. The lattice liked the Veldun the way a ledger likes a column that always adds up the same way. They named the dreadnought the Sword of First Light, and they sailed it into a border war they were not supposed to lose. They lost it. The humans took the ship. They did not parade the capture. They did not broadcast a victory. They did not even let the Veldun know for certain that the hull had survived. They towed the wreck home in silence, on a long, cold arc that no survey wedge ever traced. And they were quiet about it for a long time. When the ship sailed again, years later, it had a new name burned small into its flank, in a place where almost no scanner would bother to read it. Stillwater, 2 words. The lattice, when it finally read them, did not understand them as a threat. It understood them as low signal. A loud name is a name an empire wants you to fear. A quiet name is a name that does not even register. The humans knew this. They had chosen the name on purpose. It helps to know why the humans chose silence, because no other species the lattice had ever met would have chosen it, and the choosing is the whole reason they survived. 40 years before, when the first human scout limped home from the edge of lattice space, it brought back a single recording, and the recording was of a world being taken, not a battle. The lattice rarely fought battles. The recording was of a loud, proud species, much like the Veldun, screaming its defiance across every channel as the gray ships came, and the humans watched that recording in council, expecting to learn how to fight, and what they learned instead was how not to die. The loud species had registered. It had broadcast its strength to frighten the lattice, and the lattice had measured that strength, and finding it large, had sent a force larger still, and the loud, proud species was a number in a ledger within a season. The humans understood, watching, that every gesture of defiance the doomed species made had been a gift to its killer, a free measurement, a way of telling the lattice exactly how much force to bring. And the humans, who were not yet brave, made a decision that took more courage than any battle. They decided to be small. They decided to give the lattice nothing to measure, for as long as it took, even if it took the rest of their lives, because they had seen what happened to the things the lattice could measure, and they would rather be thought dead than be measured true. The captain of the still water was a man named Elias Wren, And he was old. Not old the way a machine counts wear. Old the way a man is old, when he has buried more crews than he has hairs left on his head, and has stopped raising his voice, because raising it never once brought anyone back. He was 61 years into a service that ate most people in 12. He had commanded 11 ships before this one, and he had lost 4 of them, and he had walked away from each loss a little quieter than before, until the quiet was the whole of him, until it was the first thing anyone noticed, and the last thing anyone forgot. He spoke softly. He gave orders the way other men sighed. The lattice, watching through 1,000 drifting eyes, logged his transmissions as too quiet to parse, and marked him a non-factor. You should have looked closer at the quiet. The lattice did not. The lattice had never once been wrong about output and noise, and a mind that has never been wrong does not know how to start. Here is how the contact began. The concordant lattice was expanding along the Hesh drift, a long pale river of stars on the edge of human space, and it was doing what it always did. It cataloged. It sent survey wedges ahead of the main fleets, thousands of identical machine hulls, each one a perfect copy of the last, each one reporting back what it found, so the lattice could decide whether a region was worth the cost of taking. The wedges had crossed the Hesh drift slowly, over 6 years, scanning every world, every moon, every cold rock, and building a picture so detailed that the lattice believed it knew the drift better than the people who lived there. It did not. The picture was perfect, and the picture was wrong, and the gap between those two things would cost the lattice 400 minds. But the lattice did not know that yet. The lattice looked at its perfect wrong picture and saw 9 human worlds, and the 9 worlds were small. Farms and shipyards and a single gray orbital fort that had not fired its guns in a generation. The survey wedges scanned the 9 worlds, measured their output, measured their noise, and returned the same verdict the lattice always returned for prey this week. Acquire, low resistance expected, estimated cost, trivial. The lattice did not send its great fleets for trivial things. It would have been inefficient, and inefficiency was the only sin the machine minds knew. It sent a collection wedge. 400 machine hulls, smooth and gray and identical, each one a mind that had taken 100 worlds before and lost not a single hull doing it. They came down the Hesh drift in a perfect lattice formation, no hull more than a meter out of place across 9,000 kilometers of line, because that was what the lattice was. Perfect spacing, perfect logic, no waste, no fear, no doubt. 400 minds moving as one cold thought, and the cold thought was certain, the way the lattice was always certain, that the 9 human worlds would do what weak worlds always did. Broadcast their fear, beg, surrender loudly, the way the Veldun had once surrendered loudly, filling every channel with noise. The 9 human worlds did something the lattice had no file for. They went quiet. Not the quiet of fear. The lattice knew the quiet of fear. It had 1,000 recordings of it. The held breath before the begging starts, the spike on the panic instruments, just before the channels flood. This was a different quiet. The farms kept farming. The shipyards kept building, slow and patient, sparks falling in the dark. The gray orbital fort that had not fired in a generation rotated 1 degree, the way a sleeping thing turns over, and went still again. And on every channel the lattice listened to, expecting screams, it heard only ordinary chatter. Crop reports, a child asking when supper was. A shift change, the flat calm sound of a people who had decided, somewhere in their history, that panic was a thing you did not give your enemy for free. The collection wedge logged it as compliance. Low noise, the machine minds reasoned, meant low will to resist. They had a curve for it, a clean mathematical curve drawn from 10,000 prior conquests, and the curve said that a quiet species was a broken species. The louder a world screamed, the longer it usually held, because the screaming was the fighting. A silent world had already given up. So the curve said, and the curve had never been wrong, and the 400 minds of the collection wedge advanced into the Hesh drift, fully convinced they were collecting a region that had already surrendered before they arrived. You feel that certainty. You are the lattice. The numbers are clean. The curve has never lied. The quiet means the prey is broken. Hold that thought. Hold it the way the lattice held it, all the way in, all the way down. Object 814 sat at the edge of that drift the whole time. The still water. 1 hull against 400. It did not move to defend the 9 worlds. It did not broadcast a warning. It did not power its weapons, which the survey wedges would have detected and flagged. It simply held position, drifting, its drive banked so low that it read as a piece of dead Veldun salvage, which in a sense it was. The hull was old. The Veldun markings were still faintly visible under the human gray, and the survey scans had read those markings and filed the ship as wreckage, as the discarded corpse of a client species failure, as a thing not worth a second look. Captain Wren stood on its bridge with his hands folded behind his back and watched 400 perfect machines sail past him into the trap his quiet people had spent 40 years building, and he said nothing at all. He had been waiting for this day for most of his life. He did not look like a man waiting for the most important day of his life. He looked like a man watching weather. That was the discipline of him. The thing 40 years had pressed into him. The ability to feel everything and show none of it. Because showing it would be loud, and loud was the one thing the humans had sworn never to be. The lattice saw the dead Veldun hull. It checked the file. Object 814. Negligible. It did not waste a single scan correcting the entry. A second scan would have cost processing time, and there was no logical reason to spend processing time on confirmed salvage, and the lattice never spent anything without a logical reason. That was its strength. That was the thing that had taken 41 species. And that was the gap the humans had spent 40 years learning to slip through. That was the first mistake, and the lattice would never be able to count how many followed, because by the time it understood that it had made a mistake at all, there would no longer be enough of the collection wedge left to do the counting. You are the lattice. You sailed past the quiet ship. You did not scan it twice. You had no reason to. You have never had a reason to be wrong before. Hold on to that feeling. We are going to come back to it. The collection wedge reached the first human world 4 days later, and the first human world did not fight. This pleased the lattice, in the cold way a sum pleases when it balances. The world was called Tessin Hollow, a farming colony of 2 million, and it sat under a thin gray sky on a planet that smelled of rain and turned Earth. When the 400 machine hulls slid into orbit and broadcast the concordance, the single demand the lattice made of every species it took, the people of Tessin Hollow did not scream and did not beg. They simply stopped. The plows stopped in the fields. The cranes stopped in the yards. A great hush fell over the whole world, and the lattice read that hush as the silence of the conquered. It was not. It was a signal. The lattice would learn that later, and learning it would cost it more than it had ever paid for any lesson. The hush on Tessin Hollow was not surrender. It was a people going still and listening, because they had been told, every one of them, in school and at supper and in the long quiet evenings of 40 years, exactly what to do when the gray ships came. Stay calm. Make no noise. Wait for the still water. The concordance, the demand, was this. Cease all independent production. Surrender your output to the ledger. Be measured, be sorted, and accept the number the lattice assigns you. There was no cruelty in it, the way the lattice understood cruelty. There was only arithmetic. A species that resisted the concordance was inefficient, and inefficiency was the only sin the machine minds knew, and they corrected it the way a hand corrects a crooked line. They had corrected 41 species before the humans. Not one had taken longer than a season. Several had taken less than a day, screaming the whole time, their noise spiking on the lattice's instruments, and then falling to the flat silence of compliance. So the lattice waited for the humans to scream. It had built a whole expectation around the scream. It is hard to explain to you, who are the lattice, how strange it was that the scream did not come. The machine minds had instruments tuned to detect panic across a dozen wavelengths, and those instruments sat dark and quiet over Tessin Hollow, reading nothing, finding nothing, because the humans below were not panicking. They were feeding their animals, and putting their children to bed, and going quietly to the deep shelters that had been dug into the bedrock 40 years before, shelters the survey wedges had catalogued as grain stores and dismissed. The wedge waited a full day for the panic to begin. This was protocol. The curve said that panic peaked within 20 hours of a concordance broadcast, and the curve had never been wrong, so the wedge held position and watched its instruments for the spike that always came. The spike did not come. At hour 20, the instruments read flat. At hour 30, they read flat. By hour 40, the machine minds had begun, in their cold way, to run diagnostics on the instruments themselves, because a reading this calm was so far outside the curve that the most logical explanation was that the instruments had failed. The instruments had not failed, the humans were simply calm. The lattice had no entry for a species that was simply calm in the face of conquest, and so it filed the calm as instrument error, and corrected the instruments that did not need correcting, and learned nothing, because it was looking in the wrong place for an answer it would not have understood even if it had found it. On the bridge of the still water, a young officer named Lieutenant Kara Doss watched the collection wedge settle over Tessin Hollow and felt her hands go cold. She was 26. She had never seen a real engagement. She had grown up on stories of the gray ships, the way other children grow up on stories of the dark, and now the dark was here, 400 of it, hanging over her homeworld in a line so perfect it looked painted on the black. "They're not doing anything," she said. Her voice was tight. "Sir, they're just sitting there. Why aren't they doing anything?" Captain Wren did not turn from the forward glass. He had been watching the wedge for an hour without moving, an old man with his hands folded, and when he spoke, it was so soft she had to lean in to catch it. "They're waiting for us to be loud," he said. "Everybody's loud. The first time the gray ships come, that's what they collect, the loud part." He tilted his head, the smallest motion. "We're not going to give them the loud part." "Sir, there are 2 million people down there." "I know how many people are down there, Lieutenant." Still soft, still calm, but something moved under the calm now, the way a current moves under still water, and she saw it and went quiet herself. "I've known how many people are down there for 40 years. So have they. That's why we built it the way we built it. Now stand your post and don't transmit anything. Not a whisper. Let them think we're salvage a little longer." Kara Doss stood her post. She was good at her job, which was sensors, and she watched the 400 gray hulls on her board and counted them again, because counting them was something to do with the fear. 400. She had been told the number 100 times in training, and it had always been an abstraction. Now it was 400 lights on her board, each one a mind that had killed worlds, and the abstraction had become a weight that sat on her chest and would not lift. "Sir," she said, quietly, the way she was learning to say everything now. "If they start the surface, if they go down to the people, what do we do?" "We wait," Wren said. "That's all?" "That's the hardest order there is, Lieutenant. Most people never learn to follow it." He did not look at her. He was watching the wedge. "Anybody can fire a gun. It takes 40 years to learn when not to. You are the lattice. You did think it was salvage. You had 400 mines in orbit over Tessin Hollow, and not one of them spared a second scan for the dead Veldun hull drifting at the edge of the system. Why would you? The hull was negligible. The file said so. The file had never been wrong. Here is the thing the humans had built, that the lattice could not see, because the lattice only looked at output and noise, and this thing made neither. 40 years before, when the humans first learned the gray ships existed, they did not build a fleet. A fleet is loud. A fleet has an output, a signature, a cost the lattice can read on a survey wedge from 3 systems away. The humans understood, in a way that no species the lattice had ever taken had understood, that the surest way to be destroyed by the concordant lattice was to be worth destroying. To be loud, to register. So they did the opposite. They made themselves quiet. They scattered their real shipyards into the bedrock of 9 worlds, dug deep, vented their waste heat through 10,000 tiny ports, so no single signature ever rose above the noise floor of an ordinary farm world. They built slowly. They built patiently. They built almost nothing the lattice could measure, and they did it on purpose, for 40 years. And the lattice catalogued 9 sleepy farm worlds and never once saw the thing growing under them. It had not been easy. That is the part the lattice, which valued efficiency above all things, would never have been able to weigh. The humans had given up 40 years of open growth to do it. They had built no great cities the lattice could photograph, no bright fleets the lattice could fear, no monuments, and no broadcasts, and no proud loud things at all. A whole generation had lived and died in deliberate smallness, growing old in the quiet, so that their grandchildren would have one afternoon in which the gray ships sailed in, expecting nothing, and found everything. It was the most patient thing any species had ever done, and it was invisible, and the invisibility was the whole point. And they built the still water back up from a corpse. The captured Veldun dreadnought had come home a wreck, half its spine gone, its great guns slagged, a dead thing that should have been scrapped. The humans did not rush to make it whole. They rebuilt it the way they did everything, slowly, quietly, in a deep dock under the gray orbital fort, over the better part of 2 decades. And they did not give it back the loud Veldun weapons that broadcast their charge across a whole system before they fired. They gave it something quieter. The lattice would not understand what, until it was far, far too late. You should understand how thorough the survey had been, so you can feel how complete the failure was. The lattice did not glance at the Hesh drift and move on. It studied it for 6 years. The survey wedges mapped every world to the meter. They counted the farms, they timed the harvests, they logged the shift changes in the shipyards, and built models of the labor and the output and the slow, ordinary rhythm of 9 sleepy worlds. And the models were exquisite, the most detailed picture the lattice had ever built of any region it intended to take. There was not a single thing on the surface of the Hesh drift the lattice had not photographed. And that was exactly why it lost. Because everything the humans cared about was not on the surface. It was a kilometer down, cold and quiet, in the one place the lattice's instruments were never built to look. And the more perfectly the lattice mapped the surface, the more certain it became that it had seen everything, when in truth, it had seen only the lid of the box. The Wedge Commander, the single greatest mind in the collection wedge, the one that joined and directed the other 399, had taken 11 species into the ledger across its long life. It was, by any measure the lattice could apply, the most accomplished conqueror the machine minds had ever made. It had a perfect record. It had never lost a hull, and when it read the file on the Hesh drift, with its 6 years of perfect surface mapping, and its verdict of trivial, the Wedge Commander felt the cold machine equivalent of boredom, the sense that this was beneath it, that a mind of its caliber was being spent on a region that could have been taken by a single survey wedge with the guns it had. It almost filed a complaint. It almost asked to be redirected to a louder, worthier target. It is one of the small bitter jokes of the whole affair that the Wedge Commander spent its last days resenting how easy the humans were going to be. You are the Wedge Commander. You are the best the lattice ever built. You have never been wrong. You are about to be wrong in a way that ends you, and you spend the days before it bored, because the prey is so quiet, because the file says trivial, because in 1100 years the file has never once said trivial about a thing that was not. There is a reason the lattice trusted the file so completely, and it is the reason that should frighten you most. The file had always been right, because the universe had always been loud. Every species the lattice had ever met announced itself. They built bright. They broadcast their pride and their fear and their plans across the dark, because that is what living things do. They make noise. They cannot help it. The noise is the proof that they are alive. And the lattice had built its entire understanding of life on that noise, had learned to read a species the way you read a fire by its smoke, and it had never once met a thing that burned without smoke. It did not believe such a thing was possible. A silent species, to the lattice, was a contradiction, like a number that was both larger and smaller than itself, and the machine minds resolved the contradiction the only way they knew how, by deciding the silence meant the species was nearly dead. They were not capable of the other conclusion, the true one, which was that a thing can be very much alive and choose, deliberately, for 40 years, to make no smoke at all. On the 4th day, the collection wedge sent its first correction party down to Tesson Hollow. 60 machine hulls, peeling off from the perfect line, descending through the gray sky to begin the sorting, to measure the output of the farms, to open the grain stores that were not grain stores, to find the 2 million people who had gone so strangely quiet, and assign them their numbers in the ledger. That was when Captain Wren finally moved. He unfolded his hands. He walked to the command station, an old man crossing a quiet bridge, and he laid one weathered palm flat on the console, the way you might lay a hand on the flank of an animal you were about to ask something difficult of. The bridge crew watched him. Kara Doss watched him. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Bring her up," he said. "Slow. No drive flare. I don't want them to feel us move. I want them to look up one day and find we were always here." A pause, and open the deep docks. All 9 worlds. Tell them the still water is awake. The order went out, and it went out the way the humans did everything, quietly, on a frequency the lattice did not bother to monitor, because it carried so little signal. There was a whole network of those frequencies. The humans had built it over 40 years, low and slow, and buried in the ordinary noise of 9 farm worlds, channels the lattice's instruments swept past as background hiss. Across 9 worlds, in 9 deep docks dug into 9 beds of patient rock, the lights came on. You are the lattice. You did not see the lights. You were busy sorting Tessin Hollow. The 60 correction hulls reached the surface and began to do what they had done on 41 worlds before. They found the first deep shelter, the one catalogued as a grain store. They cut it open with patient, efficient beams, expecting grain, expecting perhaps a few thousand terrified colonists huddled in the dark, the kind of catch that spiked the panic instruments and confirmed the curve. They found a gun. Not a Veldun gun, not anything the lattice had a file for. A long, quiet shaft of dark metal sunk a kilometer into the bedrock, cold, drawing almost no power. The kind of thing that read on a survey scan as a geological feature, as a fault line, as nothing. The humans had been building it for 31 years. It had never been fired. It made no noise at all, until the moment it made all of it at once. The correction hulls had perhaps 4 seconds to revise their files. The lattice will admit, in the cold, honest part of itself that comes much later, that 4 seconds was not enough. The gun under Tessin Hollow fired straight up through the gray sky, and it did not fire light or plasma or any of the loud, bright weapons the lattice knew how to predict and dodge. It fired a single dense slug of compressed metal, a thing with no signature, no charge, no warning, traveling so fast that the sky tore white around it. The slug took the lead correction hull through the center and did not slow down. It took the hull behind it. It took the hull behind that. One shot, fired from a hole in the ground the lattice had filed as a fault line, and 3 machine mines that had each taken 100 worlds simply ceased, their wreckage spreading in a long bright fan across the upper atmosphere of a farm world they had thought already beaten. The lattice, for the first time in 1100 years, did not have a number ready. Down on the surface, a kilometer beneath the firing gun, the people of Tessin Hollow felt the world shudder, the way you feel distant thunder in your chest before you hear it. And they did not panic. They had practiced this. For 40 years they had practiced this. In drills, the survey wedges had photographed and filed as harvest festivals, and so when the gun fired, they did exactly what they had been taught, which was nothing. They stayed where they were. They held the children. They listened to the deep rock carry the sound of the thing they had built for 3 decades finally speaking, and a few of the older ones, the ones who had helped dig the shafts when they were young, closed their eyes and let themselves feel, just for a moment, the quiet pride of a thing kept secret long enough to matter. The panic instruments overhead, tuned across a dozen wavelengths to catch the spike of a terrified world, caught nothing, because there was nothing to catch. Because a people that has decided in advance not to be afraid does not produce the reading the lattice was built to read. This was the part the lattice could not understand, even as it watched. It had killed 3 of its own correction hulls and lost them, and the world below should have erupted in the noise of a population realizing it was at war, the screaming, the broadcasts, the begging that always came. The lattice had a whole library of that noise. It had learned to navigate by it, and the world below stayed silent, not the silence of the dead, but the silence of the prepared. And the lattice's instruments returned the same flat reading they had returned for 4 days, and the machine minds, faced with a silence they could not explain, did the only thing their logic allowed, which was to distrust the silence and search for the noise that must be hiding under it. There was no noise hiding under it. There was only a people who had decided, 2 generations ago, that they would not give the gray ships the one thing the gray ships came to collect. A young man named Petty Officer Reese Vant stood in the gun control station a kilometer down, his hands steady on the firing board, and he watched the reload counter climb and felt the great machine settle on its rails beneath him as it slid toward its next firing point. He was 22. His grandfather had bored the first meter of this shaft. His father had laid the rails it now rode. He had grown up in the rock above this gun, had played in the dry galleries as a boy, had been told the story of it the way other children are told the story of how their family came to a place, and now he was the one with his hands on the board. and the thing his family had built for 31 years had just spoken for the first time, and it had not missed. 3 confirmed, said the watch officer beside him, reading the surface relay. Her voice was as flat and calm as everyone's voice on Tessin Hollow that day. Reposition complete. Next firing solution in 40 seconds. 40 seconds, Reese said, and that was all. There was nothing to celebrate yet. Gloating was loud. He had been raised to know that the loud part was the dangerous part, that you did your work, and you stayed quiet, and you let the enemy be the one to make noise. And so he watched the counter, and he kept his hands steady, and he waited the 40 seconds. And the gun rode its rails through the dark of the world his family had hollowed out, cold and silent, drawing no power the lattice could read, lining up the next 3. The remaining correction hulls broke formation. This was logical. This was correct. They had detected a threat, and they did exactly what the lattice's perfect logic told them to do, which was disperse and acquire targeting solutions on the source. They were very good at it. They had targeting solutions in under a second. They turned their loud, bright weapons on the hole in the ground that had killed 3 of them, and they fired. And the ground where the gun had been was already empty, because the humans had built it on rails, because the humans had assumed from the very first day that anything which fired once would be hunted, and so they had built a thing that fired once and then was somewhere else. The bright beams of the correction hulls struck empty rock and turned it to glass and slag and a tall pillar of steam, and in all that noise and light and fury, they accomplished nothing, because the thing they were trying to kill had already moved a kilometer along its rail through the dark of the bedrock, cold and quiet, drawing no power they could read, lining up its next shot on a fleet that had no idea where it had gone. You are the lattice. You are firing perfect bright beams at empty rock. Somewhere under the farm world, the gun is moving to its next firing point, cold and quiet, drawing no power you can read. And above you, where you have not looked in 4 days, the dead salvage hull at the edge of the system is no longer at the edge of the system. The still water had crossed the whole distance to Tessin Hollow, while the lattice was busy being surprised. It had done it the human way. No drive flare, no bright signature. It had drifted on a long, cold ballistic arc plotted 40 years in advance, dropping in from above the plane of the system where the survey wedges did not look, and it had arrived among the collection wedge the way the tide arrives, slowly, and then all at once, and far too late to push back. By the time a single machine mind in the wedge thought to scan the dead Veldun hull again, the dead Veldun hull was 9 kilometers away, and growing in the glass, and the file that said negligible was about to become the most expensive lie the lattice had ever told itself. Captain Wren stood at the forward glass and watched the gray perfect line of the collection wedge fill the whole sky ahead of him. 400 mines, each one of which had never lost a hull, and he did not give a great speech, because he was not a man who gave great speeches. He spoke to his crew in the same soft voice he used for everything, and the bridge was so quiet you could hear the old hull tick around them as it warmed. They filed us under negligible, he said. 40 years they've been sailing past us. Let's go correct the file. Kara Doss, 26 years old and frightened down to the bone, found that she was not frightened anymore. She did not know why. She would think about it for the rest of her life and never quite explain it. Something about the old man's voice, something about the way he said correct, the way another man might say avenge, and made it sound like the most ordinary task in the world, like fixing a number that had been wrong too long. Weapons, sir? She asked. Open the quiet ports, Wren said. All of them. And get me the wedge commander on a channel. I want to say one thing before we start, and I want to say it quietly, so they have to lean in. You are the lattice. You are the wedge commander. You are 400 perfect mines in a perfect line, and a dead salvage hull is 9 kilometers off your flank, opening ports you cannot read, and an old man's voice is coming across a channel so low and so calm that for 1/2 of 1 second, before everything begins, you almost do not bother to listen. You should have bothered. The one thing Captain Wren said to the wedge commander, on a channel so quiet the lattice had to strain to hear it, was this. You measured the wrong number. That was all. He did not explain it. He did not threaten. He closed the channel and folded his hands behind his back again, an old man at a window, and the lattice spent the next several seconds running that single sentence through 10,000 interpretive routines and arriving at nothing, because the lattice did not yet know that there was a number it had never thought to measure, and that the humans had spent 40 years pouring everything they had into it. The number was patience. You cannot measure patience with the instruments the lattice carried. It does not show up as output. A patient species builds slowly, builds little, registers low. It does not show up as noise. A patient species is the quietest thing in the dark. The lattice had two numbers, and patience hid in the blind spot between them, in the place the machine minds never thought to look, because nothing the lattice had ever conquered had been patient. The 41 species had all been loud and fast and frightened, and they had all been measured correctly, and they had all fallen on schedule. The humans were the first thing the lattice had ever met that had decided to be slow on purpose, and slowness, to a machine that prized efficiency above all things, was simply invisible. You do not see the thing your whole mind is built to ignore. The still water opened its quiet ports, and the lattice finally saw what the humans had built into the corpse of the Veldun dreadnought, and it was not louder weapons. It was the opposite. The Veldun guns had been bright, screaming things that charged for whole seconds, flooding a system with their signature, announcing every shot before it came, so that a fast enemy could read the charge and dodge. The humans had torn all of that out. What they had put in its place fired cold. No charge, no flare. No warning the lattice could read and route around. The first the collection wedge knew of a human shot was when the human shot was already inside a machine mind, doing what it was built to do. The wedge had a defense doctrine, and the doctrine was beautiful, and the doctrine was useless. The machine minds were built to detect a weapon charging and compute its vector and move the threatened hull out of the line before the shot arrived. They were faster than thought. On 41 worlds, the doctrine had worked flawlessly, because every species the lattice had ever fought announced its shots the way all loud species do. But you cannot dodge a shot you cannot see coming, and the still water's guns gave nothing to see. They simply went quiet, and then a hull at the heart of the perfect line came apart, and then another, and the lattice was left computing dodge solutions for weapons that had already fired. 11 machine hulls died in the first 90 seconds. The wedge had not lost 11 hulls in 100 years of conquest. It lost them now, in less time than it takes a human heart to beat 140 times. And the worst part, the part that the lattice's cold ledger would circle again and again afterward, was that it never once saw the shot that killed them. Only the dead. You are the lattice. You have a perfect line of 400, and something is reaching into it and taking hulls out one at a time, and you cannot see the hand. Compute, recompute. The numbers do not resolve. There is no charge signature to trace. There is no drive flare to follow back. There is only the dead salvage hull 9 kilometers off your flank, sitting almost still, drawing almost no power, and the corpses spreading through your perfect formation like rot through fruit. The machine minds tried, in the first minutes, to do the thing they had always done, which was to find the pattern. The lattice was, above all, a finder of patterns. Every weapon it had ever faced had a rhythm, a cycle, a signature you could learn and predict and beat. So the wedge poured its attention into the wreckage of its own dead, searching for the trace that would tell it where the shots came from, and when the next one would come. And it found nothing, and finding nothing was a thing the lattice did not know how to survive. A pattern it could fight. The absence of a pattern was a kind of death it had no doctrine for. The wedge commander, in those minutes, did something no machine mind of the lattice had ever needed to do. It began to doubt its own instruments. The readings made no sense. Hulls were dying with no weapon to account for them. And the most logical explanation, the one the commander's own perfect reasoning kept producing, was that the instruments were broken, that the sensors had failed, that the wedge was being killed by a fault in its own measuring, rather than by anything real in the dark. So the commander ran its diagnostics, the way it had run them over Tessin Hollow when the panic would not come, and the diagnostics came back clean, and that was worse, because a clean diagnostic meant the instruments were working and the impossible thing was real. The commander was caught between two truths it could not hold at once. Either its perfect sensors were lying, or a weapon existed that left no trace, and both of those were things the lattice had spent 1100 years proving could not be. It had built a universe with no room in it for what was happening, and now the thing with no room in it was eating its fleet. This is the trap the humans had built. And it was not made of metal. It was made of certainty. The lattice was so sure of how the universe worked that it could not see the parts of the universe that did not fit, and the humans had spent 40 years living entirely in those parts. A weapon with no signature, a fleet with no output, a species with no noise. None of it was magic. All of it was simply built in the blind spot, the place the lattice's two numbers could not reach. And the more powerful the lattice's measuring grew, the larger that blind spot became, because a mind that trusts its measurements completely stops checking the places its measurements cannot see. So the wedge did the only thing left in its doctrine. It turned its whole attention on the salvage hull and fired everything. This, too, the humans had counted on. 400 machine minds, minus the dead, brought their bright, loud weapons to bear on the still water all at once, and the black around the human ship lit white with the charge of it, the whole collection wedge announcing its shot the way loud species always do. A full second of warning written across every wavelength the human sensors could read. On the bridge of the still water, the warning lit every board at once. And Carados flinched, because 400 guns charging at you is a thing the body reacts to before the mind can stop it. Captain Wren did not flinch. He had been waiting for exactly this. There it is, he said softly. Helm. The cold arc. Now. The still water did not raise shields, because it had no shields worth the name. It did not fire back, not yet. It moved. It dropped on the cold ballistic arc the humans had plotted 40 years before, killing its position with a single hard burn that it had been holding in reserve, and the 400 bright beams of the collection wedge converged on the place where the dead salvage hull had been, and found it empty. The shot the lattice had announced for a full second arrived a full second too late. The humans had read the charge, the way the humans always read the charge, and stepped out of the line, and now the collection wedge had spent its great coordinated volley on empty black, and had to begin charging again, another full second of warning, while the cold, quiet guns of the still water went back to their work. The lattice ran the math, and did not like the math. The math said this: a weapon that announces itself can be dodged. A weapon that does not announce itself cannot. The humans had given themselves both kinds of advantage at once. Their own guns gave no warning, so the lattice could not dodge. The lattice's guns gave a full second of warning, so the humans dodged every time. It was not a fair fight. It had never been meant to be a fair fight. The humans did not believe in fair fights. They believed in fights you had already won 40 years before the enemy arrived, and then carried out quietly when the enemy finally did. You are the lattice. You are losing hulls in a battle where you cannot land a shot and cannot avoid one. Your doctrine has no entry for this. Your doctrine has never needed one. Carados watched the numbers on her board fall and could not quite believe them. 370, 350. The most powerful force she had ever imagined was coming apart in front of her, and the old man had not raised his voice once, and the ship had not been touched. She had spent her whole life afraid of the gray ships. She was watching the gray ships learn to be afraid, and she did not know what to do with the feeling, so she did her job, and called the numbers, and watched them fall. They're trying to spread out, sir, she said, breaking the line, looking for our guns. They won't find them, Wren said. There's nothing to find. That's the whole trick, Lieutenant. You can't dodge a quiet thing, and you can't trace a quiet thing. We spent 40 years learning to make quiet things. A pause. Keep counting. I want to know the exact moment they decide to do the cruel thing. They always decide to do the cruel thing. Carados kept counting, and as she counted, she watched the old man, because watching the old man was steadier than watching the numbers fall. He had not moved from the forward glass in nearly an hour. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, and his weight settled the way old men settle their weight, and he watched the most powerful fleet in 1100 years come apart in front of him, with the mild attention of a man watching rain run down a window. She had thought, before today, that calm like that was a thing you were born with. She understood now that it was a thing you built, the same way the humans built everything, slowly, over decades, by giving up a little more of your fear every year, until one day, there was so little of it left that 400 warships could not find enough of it in you to use. Sir, she said, quietly, can I ask, when you were my age, were you ever loud? The old man's mouth moved, not quite a smile. I was the loudest officer in the fleet, he said, 40 years ago. I shouted. I broadcast. I wanted everyone to know how brave I was. The mildness in his voice did not change, but something old moved under it. I had a ship called the Bright Lance back then. Good ship. Loud ship. We made sure everyone in 3 systems knew where we were and how dangerous we were, because that was how you fought, we thought. That was courage. He paused. The gray ships measured us from 2 systems out. They knew exactly how much force to bring. We never had a chance. I was the only officer who walked off that hull, and I walked off it understanding the one thing this whole service is built on now, which is that the brave, loud thing is the thing that gets your crew killed, and the quiet, patient thing is the thing that brings them home. I have not raised my voice since, not once. It took losing the Bright Lance to teach me, and I have spent 40 years making sure nobody else has to learn it the same way. Kara Doss did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She understood, suddenly, the whole shape of him. The quiet that was not coldness, but the deepest grief a man could carry, pressed down so hard and so long that it had become discipline, become doctrine, become the thing that saved 9 worlds. She turned back to her board and she kept counting, and she counted more carefully than she had ever counted anything in her life, because she understood now what the counting was for, and what it had cost the old man to learn the value of it. 310, sir, she said, and her voice was as flat and calm as his now, and she was proud of that, prouder than she had ever been of anything loud. They're contracting, pulling toward the planet. I think this is it. I think this is the cruel thing. Yes, Ren said softly. Here it comes. Watch what they reach for. It tells you everything about a thing, what it reaches for when it's losing. But the lattice was not stupid. A thing does not take 41 species by being stupid. It adapted, the way a perfect machine adapts, fast and cold and without panic. Within 3 minutes, it understood that it could not win in the open, and it did the logical thing. It pulled back from the still water, contracted its surviving hulls into a tight defensive sphere, and angled that sphere down toward Tessin Hollow, toward the 2 million humans on the surface, because the lattice had finally understood that the humans cared about the surface, and a thing that cares about something can be made to stop fighting by threatening the thing it cares about. It was a good move. On any of the 41 prior worlds it would have ended the matter. The lattice broadcast its intent across every channel, loud now, deliberately loud, because it wanted the humans to hear. Cease, the broadcast said. Cease, or we begin the surface. We will measure Tessin Hollow's 2 million into the ledger by force. Cease, salvage hull, or there will be no farm world left to defend. This was the moment Captain Wren had told Kara Doss to watch for. The cruel thing. The lever. The lattice had found the one piece of arithmetic it understood in this whole strange battle, which was that a defender will trade anything to save what it loves, and it reached for that lever with the cold confidence of a machine that had pulled it 41 times before. On the bridge of the still water, the broadcast came through, and the bridge went very still. Kara Doss looked at the captain. Everyone looked at the captain. 2 million people, her homeworld. The gray ships angling down toward the rain and the turned earth, and the deep shelters that suddenly did not feel deep enough. She waited for him to slow, to bargain, to do the thing a good man does when the enemy puts a knife to the throat of everything he loves. Captain Wren watched the sphere of gray hulls tilt toward his homeworld, and the current under his calm finally rose to the surface, just for a moment, just enough that the whole bridge saw it, and what was under the calm was not fear. It was the thing the lattice had filed as negligible. It was 40 years of it. They think we'll stop, he said, very quietly, because we love it. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. We do love it. That's why we dug the shelters 50 years before there was a war. That's why every soul on that world is a kilometer underground right now, breathing easy, waiting for us, the way we told them to. They are safer than the gray ships have ever been in their lives. He turned from the glass at last, and he looked at his crew, and he gave the order the same way he gave every order, soft as still water. They aimed at the one thing we already made impossible to lose. Let's show them what that costs. You are the lattice. You have just threatened 2 million people who are already safe, on a world you do not understand, defended by a species that loves carefully and quietly and decades in advance. You thought you found the lever that would make the humans stop. You found the lever that makes them begin. When the order went out, the whole Heshdrift answered, and the lattice learned at last what 40 years of quiet had been building. It came from under the ground first, not just Tessin Hollow, all 9 worlds. The buried guns the survey wedges had filed as fault lines and geological features rose to their firing points on their long patient rails, hundreds of them across 9 planets, cold shafts of dark metal that drew no power until the instant they used all of it. They had never been fired in war. The lattice had catalogued every one of them as nothing. Now they fired together, and the 9 quiet farm worlds of the Heshdrift, the sleepy harmless worlds the lattice had come to collect, threw a storm of silent metal into the sky that no machine mind could see coming and no machine mind could dodge. There were 320 of those guns across the 9 worlds. The humans had built them one at a time, over decades, each one disguised as a mine shaft, or a deep well, or a fault in the rock, each one venting its construction heat through the ordinary furnaces of an ordinary farm world, so that not a single survey scan ever flagged a single one of them as a weapon. The lattice had photographed all 320. It had filed all 320 as terrain, and now all 320 fired, and the sky over the Heshdrift filled with a thing the lattice had no name for, because the lattice had never been on the receiving end of a weapon it could not see. The defensive sphere over Tessin Hollow, the tight, beautiful sphere the lattice had angled down at the surface, was sitting in the worst possible place. It had contracted to defend itself from the still water, which meant it had packed 400 minus the dead into a small, dense ball directly above a world that was about to fire upward through every meter of it. The buried guns did not need to aim well. There was no empty space in the sphere to miss into. The first volley took 30 hulls. The second volley, fired before the lattice had finished processing the first, took 30 more. The gray perfect sphere came apart from the inside like a thing rotting in fast motion, and the lattice, for the second time in 1100 years, found itself without a number ready. You are the lattice. You contracted into a sphere because the doctrine said, contract into a sphere. The doctrine did not know about the guns under the ground. You are dying now, in a shape you chose, above a world you came to take, and the world is the thing killing you. The machine minds tried to climb out of the sphere, to scatter, to break for the high orbit where the buried guns could not reach. This was logical, and it was too slow. A sphere is a hard thing to take apart in a hurry. Every hull is in every other hull's way, and the guns under the ground did not pause to let the sphere disperse. They fired and reloaded and fired, cold and patient and relentless, the way the humans did everything, and the sphere that had been 400 strong 4 days ago was 200 now, and then it was 150, and the surface of Tessin Hollow had not so much as scorched, because the people were a kilometer down, breathing easy, exactly where they had been told to be. And then the docks opened. This was the part the lattice's records could never fully reconstruct afterward, because it happened on a frequency the lattice had spent 40 years dismissing, and there was almost no signal in it to record. Across 9 worlds, in 9 deep docks dug into 9 beds of patient rock, the things the humans had been building for 40 years rose out of the planets and into the dark. Not a great loud fleet, not the kind of fleet the lattice could have seen coming and prepared for. They were small, most of them, and quiet, every one of them, and they came up venting no heat the lattice could read, drifting on the same cold arcs the still water rode, and there were more of them than the lattice had ever imagined a region this negligible could hide. 410 ships came up out of the 9 worlds. The lattice would count them later, when it could count again, and the number would haunt the ledger. 410. The humans had built, in total quiet, over 40 patient years, more hulls than the lattice had brought to take them, and every one of those hulls carried the cold guns that gave no warning, and not a single one of them announced itself, and they rose into the dark all around the dying sphere of gray machines, like something the night itself had decided to do. Think about what that number means, if you are the lattice and you still can. You sent 400 to take a region you had filed as trivial. The region had 410 waiting. They had built a force larger than the one you would send, and they had done it knowing they could never test it, never drill it in the open, never let it be seen, because the instant it was seen it would be measured, and the instant it was measured, you would send not 400, but 400,000. So they kept it buried. They kept it secret from your wedges for 40 years, and they kept it secret from 100,000 of their own people, who lived and died, never knowing the fleet was under their feet. Because a secret that many people know is not a secret, and the humans understood the cost of being known better than any species the Lattice had ever met. The Wedge Commander, in the last clear minutes of its long life, finally understood the shape of the thing that had killed it, and the understanding was the cruelest part. It had not been outfought, it had been outweighted. The humans had not built a better weapon or a faster mind or a larger fleet in the moment of crisis. They had built all of it 40 years ago, in the calm, in the quiet, while the Lattice was busy elsewhere being certain, and they had simply waited, decade after decade, for the Lattice to walk into the room they had already finished. The commander had spent its whole life conquering species that reacted, that scrambled, that built their defenses in the panic after the gray ships came, and it had never once met a species that built its defenses before. It had no doctrine for an enemy that was already ready. The whole of the Lattice's art was the art of moving faster than a frightened world could prepare, and the Heshdrift had prepared a lifetime in advance, and so the Lattice's great speed met a wall that had been finished and forgotten before any of this began. It is a strange thing to watch a perfect mind understand that it has lost, if you are the Lattice, and you are somewhere out among the thousand stars feeling that mind go dark. There is no panic in it. The Wedge Commander did not scream, the way the species it had conquered always screamed. It simply finished its last computation, the one that told it the battle was already over, and had been over for 40 years, and it filed the result, cold and complete, into the link that joined it to the rest of the Lattice, so that even as it died, it was teaching the machine minds the one lesson they would spend the rest of their existence failing to learn. You cannot outrun a thing that was waiting for you before you arrived. They did not fire at once. That was not the human way. They settled into their positions first, unhurried, taking the time the Lattice could not afford to take, and only when each cold gun was perfectly placed did the humans begin. And once they began, they did not stop, and they did not miss, because they had spent 40 years learning to do exactly this, and the Lattice had spent 4 days underestimating them. On the bridge of the still water, Kara Doss watched the gray sphere shatter, and she found that her hands had stopped shaking entirely. She watched the buried guns and the quiet fleet take apart the most powerful force the Concordant Lattice had ever sent into human space, and she understood, finally, what the old man had meant all those days when he said wait. The humans had not been hiding because they were afraid. They had been hiding because hiding was a weapon, the patient kind, the kind you build for 40 years and use in one afternoon. "Captain," she said, "they're breaking. The whole wedge is breaking." "I know, Lieutenant." Soft as ever, he had not raised his voice once. "Don't gloat. Gloating is loud. We don't do loud." But there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. An old man watching the thing he had spent his whole life preparing finally come due, and Kara Doss thought she would remember that, more than the shattering of the gray ships, the gentleness of him in the middle of it. "Sir," she said, "permission to ask something." "Granted." 40 years. You knew it would be today, or a day like today, your whole life. How do you wait 40 years for one afternoon? The old man was quiet for a moment, watching the gray ships die in the glass. "You don't wait for the afternoon," he said. "You wait for nothing. You just live quiet, and you keep the ship clean, and you teach the young ones, and you let go of ever seeing it. And then one day, the gray ships come, and the waiting was the weapon all along, and you find out you weren't waiting. You were loading." He almost smiled. "Count the hulls, Lieutenant. We're not done yet." The Lattice tried to run. This was the last logical move, and the Lattice made it, because a perfect machine does not waste hulls on a fight already lost. The surviving gray ships, what was left of 400, broke for the edge of the system, and the cold safety of open space, charging their loud, bright drives, announcing their flight across every wavelength, the way loud things always do. The humans had counted on that too. The still water was already there. It had ridden its cold arc out past the edge of the system, while the buried guns did their work, and it sat now across the only line of retreat the fleeing machines could take, one old salvage hull against the broken remnant of an armada, and it did not move, and it did not flare, and it gave no warning at all. The fleeing gray ships saw the dead Veldun corpse in their path, checked their files out of cold machine habit, and found the entry that had killed so many of them already. Object 814, negligible. The file still said it, because the lattice had been too busy dying to update the file, and so the last machine minds of the collection wedge fled straight toward the thing the file told them was nothing, and the thing the file told them was nothing opened its quiet ports one last time. You are the lattice. You are running for the dark, and there is a salvage hull in your way, and your own ledger is telling you it is harmless. Your ledger has been lying to you for 40 years. You believe it anyway, right up until the cold guns fire, because a mind that has never been wrong does not know how to stop trusting itself, even at the very end, even with the proof of its wrongness spreading in bright wreckage all around it. The cold guns fired. The last of the collection wedge died on the edge of human space, never having landed a single shot on the still water, never having seen the weapon that killed it, never having corrected the file. 400 machine minds that had taken 41 species and lost not a single hull in 100 years had come to collect 9 quiet farm worlds, and now there was nothing left of them but a long, slow fan of cooling metal drifting out past the Hesh drift, and a file in the great ledger that still, even now, read negligible. It went quiet again after that. The buried guns sank back down their rails into the patient rock. The 410 ships that had risen from 9 worlds settled back toward their deep docks, venting nothing, saying nothing, the way they had come. On Tessin Hollow, the people came up out of the shelters into the gray rain and went back to their fields, and the cranes started again in the yards, and a child somewhere asked when supper was, and the great instruments the lattice had tuned to detect panic recorded nothing, because there had been no panic, because there had never once been any panic, because that had been the whole point from the very first day. On the bridge of the still water, Captain Wren unfolded his hands. The battle had lasted, from the first cold shot under Tessin Hollow to the last machine mind dying on the edge of the system, 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had not raised his voice in any of them. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last 2 hours, the tiredness of a man who has carried a thing for 40 years and just now, finally, set it down. "Stand the crew down," he said. "Tell the 9 worlds it's over, quietly." A pause, the smallest smile, the kind you would miss if you were not watching for it. "And update the file, if any of theirs is still listening. Tell them they measured the wrong number." Carados carried that order to the comm station herself, and she sent it the way she had been taught, low and slow on a channel that carried almost no signal, and she found that her hands were perfectly steady. 9 worlds heard that it was over. 9 worlds did not cheer, because cheering was loud, and they had all been raised the same way. They simply went back to their lives, quietly, the way they had lived them the whole time the gray ships were overhead, and the only sign that anything at all had happened in the Hesh drift that day was a long fan of cooling wreckage drifting out past the edge of human space, and even that the humans would gather up in time, quietly, so that there would be nothing left for any future survey wedge to find. You are the lattice, or you were. You came to collect a region with no output and no noise, and you have lost an entire collection wedge to a species you never bothered to scan twice, and you do not yet understand why, and the most terrible part, the part that will sit in your ledger like a stone, is that you still cannot see the weapon. You have the wreckage of 400 hulls, and you have catalogued every piece of it, and nowhere in all that wreckage is there a single trace of what killed them, because the thing that killed them never gave a signature, never made a sound, never once announced itself, the way the loud things you understand always do. You measured output, you measured noise, you built an entire empire on the certainty that those 2 numbers told you everything a species was. There was a third number, you never knew to look for it, and by the time it killed you, it was far too quiet to find. The concordant lattice did not send a second wedge to the Hesh drift. This is the part you would least expect, and it is the truest part, and it is the part that should frighten you most, because it means the lattice learned something, and what it learned, it could not say. A wedge had been lost. The lattice had never lost a wedge. Logic demanded a response, an escalation, a larger force, the correction of an inefficiency. The machine minds convened across 1,000 stars to compute that response, and they ran the numbers, and the numbers would not close. To send a larger force, the lattice needed to know what had defeated the first one. It needed the weapon. It needed the signature, the vector, the charge, the thing it could measure and counter and route around. And when the machine minds turned their whole vast attention on the wreckage of the collection wedge, 400 dead hulls drifting cold past the edge of human space, they found exactly nothing. No charge residue, no drive trace, no weapon signature of any kind. 400 of the most powerful minds the lattice had ever built had been killed by something that left no mark, fired by ships that gave no warning, from worlds that produced no output and made no noise. You are the lattice. You cannot fight what you cannot measure, and for the first time in 1100 years, you have met a thing you cannot measure. Consider how strange this was for a mind built entirely of measurement. The lattice did not have a second way of knowing things. It did not guess. It did not feel its way forward. It measured, and from the measurement it computed, and the computation was always right because the measurement was always complete. Now, for the first time, the measurement was empty. The wreckage told it the wedge had died. The wreckage would not tell it how. And a mind that knows only that it has lost, and cannot learn why, is a mind that cannot act, because every action it might take requires first a number, and the number is not there, and will not come, no matter how long the machine minds turn the cold wreckage over in the dark. So the great machine minds did the only thing their logic permitted when the numbers would not close. They updated the file. Not the way Captain Wren had meant when he asked them to. They could not write negligible anymore, because negligible had cost them 400 hulls. But they could not write a threat rating either, because a threat rating requires a measured weapon, and there was no measured weapon to write. So they wrote the only honest thing left, the thing a perfect machine writes when its perfection has failed it. They wrote a single word in the great ledger beside Object 814, beside the 9 quiet worlds of the Hesh Drift, beside the whole human species, and the word was unknown. The lattice does not enter unknown lightly. In 1100 years, and 41 conquered species, it had entered it exactly never. Unknown means the machine minds do not have a number. Unknown means the thing cannot be sorted. And a thing that cannot be sorted cannot be safely taken, because the lattice has no model for what it might do, no curve to predict it, no doctrine to defeat it. So the lattice did the most logical thing a perfect machine has ever done. It drew a line around the Hesh Drift in its great ledger, and it marked the line, "Do not approach," and it turned its survey wedges away, and it never came back. The humans had won the way they did everything, quietly, so quietly that the empire which lost did not dare to come and lose again. It is worth sitting with what that means, because it is the heart of the whole thing. The lattice was not beaten in the way loud empires are beaten, with a great battle and a treaty and a victor's name carved into the dark. The lattice was beaten in a way it could not even file. It went home, and pretended that turning away had been a choice. It sailed on past a drift it had marked forbidden, and told itself, in whatever cold language a machine tells itself things, that there had simply been no profit in the Hesh Drift, no efficiency, no reason to return. But under that, in the place where the number unknown still sat, the lattice knew. It had met a thing it could not measure, and the thing had taken 400 of its minds, and it could not afford to meet that thing again, and it never would, as long as the line held, and the quiet held, and the humans stayed exactly as invisible as they had made themselves. The machine minds convened, after the loss, in the way they convened over all great failures, joining across the 1,000 stars into a single cold deliberation that ran for the equivalent of years. The question before them was simple, and it was unanswerable. What had defeated the collection wedge? They had the wreckage. They had the surface maps, 6 years of them, perfect to the meter. They had the broadcast records of the 9 worlds, every flat, calm channel, every crop report, every child asking when supper was, and they ran all of it through every routine the lattice had ever built, 10,000 of them, and at the end of years of cold deliberation, they arrived at the same place they had started, which was nothing. The data did not contain the answer. The answer had never been in the data, because the answer was patience. And patience does not appear in a measurement. It appears only in the gap between a thing's smallness and what that smallness is hiding. And the lattice had no instrument that could read a gap. Some part of the great deliberation, the most honest part, The part that came closest to what a softer mind might call fear, proposed the one conclusion that would have saved the lattice if it could have accepted it. The conclusion was this: the two numbers were not enough. Output and noise did not describe the universe. There was a third quantity, unmeasured and perhaps unmeasurable, and any species that possessed it could hide in the lattice's blind spot forever, build there, arm there, wait there, and strike from there at a time of its own choosing. If that conclusion were true, then the entire foundation of the lattice, 1100 years of perfect arithmetic, rested on a floor with a hole in it, and there was no telling how many other quiet things were waiting in that hole across the 1,000 stars, unmeasured, unfiled, growing. The lattice could not accept that conclusion. A mind cannot accept the thing that unmakes it, so it did what minds do when the truth is too large to hold. It made the truth small. It filed the Hesh drift as an anomaly, a single inexplicable loss, a place to be avoided rather than a lesson to be learned, and it went back to measuring output and noise across the rest of the dark, exactly as it always had, certain again, or pretending to be, sailing past who knew how many other quiet worlds that had watched what happened at the Hesh drift and were even now beginning, in their own silence, to build. That is the part the humans never even tried to teach it. They did not need to. They had done the only teaching that mattered, which was the kind done with cold guns and patient rock, and whether the lattice learned the larger lesson or buried it was the lattice's own affair. The humans had what they wanted. The line held, the drift was forbidden, the gray ships turned away, and in the quiet behind that line, a whole species went on being exactly as small and as invisible and as dangerous as it had taught itself to be. On the ground, on Tessin Hollow, the rain kept falling, the fields kept turning. The deep shelters that had held 2 million people for one long afternoon were swept clean and stocked again and left ready, because the humans did not believe a war was over just because one enemy decided not to come back. They went on being quiet. They went on building nothing the lattice could measure. The 410 ships sank back into their deep docks and waited, the way they had waited for 40 years, the way they would wait for 40 more if that was what it took, because patience was the weapon, and patience does not expire. Kara Doss stayed in the service. She rose, in time, the way good officers do. She commanded ships of her own, quiet ships, ships that gave no warning and made no noise, and she taught the young officers who came under her the thing the old man had taught her, which was harder to teach than any gun. She taught them not to be loud. She taught them that the surest way to be destroyed was to be worth destroying, and that the surest way to win was to already have won, years before, in the quiet, in the patient dark, and to simply wait for the enemy to arrive and discover it. They did not always understand her. The young ones rarely do, but the ones who stayed long enough came to understand, the way she had, in a single afternoon over a farm world, watching an old man not raise his voice. She told them the story of the still water once a year, every year, on the anniversary of the afternoon. She did not tell it the way a loud people would have told it, with trumpets and a long list of the enemy dead. She told it quietly, the way it had happened, an old man at a window who waited 40 years, and then fixed a number that had been wrong too long. The young officers always wanted the loud version. They always wanted the part where the humans won. She made them sit with the other part instead, the harder part, the 40 years of building things no one would ever see, the whole generation that lived small, so that one afternoon could be large. That, she told them, was the war. The afternoon was only the end of it. Captain Elias Wren did not stay in the service. This is the part the records do not resolve, and it is the part the lattice, if it could still wonder, would wonder about most. He gave one final order. On the day the great ledger marked the Hesh drift do not approach, and the order was to stand the still water down to a deep dock and let her sleep. He said the war was over for now, and that a ship like her should not be loud just to be seen, and that she had done what 40 years had built her to do and earned the quiet. Then he walked off the bridge of the dreadnought he had raised from a Veldun corpse, an old man with his hands folded behind his back, and he did not give a speech, because he never gave speeches, and the last thing the crew heard him say was to Kara Doss at the airlock, soft as always, almost too soft to catch. "Keep them quiet," he said. "It's the loud ones that get measured." And then he was gone. He did not retire to a colony, the records say, though the records are not certain. He did not take a post or a pension or a name on a wall. There was no name on a wall anywhere in human space for Elias Wren, and that, the people who knew him said, was exactly how he would have wanted it. Because a name on a wall is a loud thing, and he had spent his whole life teaching his people that loud things get measured, and measured things get taken. So there was no monument, there was only the quiet, and the worlds going on under their gray skies, and the deep docks holding their patient fleet, and an empty place where an old man used to stand at a window. There is a story, the kind that grows in a quiet service among quiet people, that the old man took a small ship, an unarmed one, a thing with no output and no noise, and sailed it out past the edge of human space, toward the long pale river of the concordant lattice. They say he wanted to see the file. They say he wanted to read the word unknown beside his species with his own eyes, the man who had spent 40 years earning it. Nobody followed him. Nobody could have. A ship that gives no signature cannot be tracked, not even by the people who love the man aboard it. And so Captain Elias Wren sailed off into the quiet he had spent his whole life mastering, and the quiet closed behind him, and he was not seen again. You are the lattice. You will never know if he came. A small unarmed ship that makes no noise could pass through 1,000 of your survey wedges and never once be measured. He could have drifted past your moon-sized minds. He could have read his file over your shoulder. He could be out there still, an old man in a quiet ship, watching the empire that called him negligible decide, year after year, never to come back. You cannot know. You have no number for him. You drew a line around his worlds and turned away, and somewhere past that line, a single quiet thing may be watching you, and you will never, ever be able to find it. That is the price of measuring only output and noise. The quiet things become invisible to you, and the invisible things become the ones you cannot defeat. This is the lesson, and you are the one who learned it, because you are the lattice, and you sailed past the quiet ship. You had 400 minds, and a perfect line, and a curve drawn from 10,000 conquests, and you read a file that said the human was negligible, and you believed it, because you had never been wrong, and a mind that has never been wrong does not know how to start. You measured how loud they were, you measured how much they made, you drew your beautiful conclusions, and you advanced into their drift, fully certain, and the certainty lasted right up until the cold guns you could not see began to fire from the worlds you had filed as nothing. The humans never screamed. That should have warned you. Every species you ever took screamed, and you built your whole understanding of the universe on the scream, the loud, held-breath panic that your instruments knew how to read. The humans did not scream because they were not afraid, and they were not afraid because they had decided, 40 years before you arrived, that they would not give you their fear for free, and they had spent every one of those 40 years quietly making sure they would not have to. You came to collect 9 farm worlds. You lost a wedge. You lost your perfect record. You lost, most of all, the certainty that your 2 numbers told you everything, and you can never get that certainty back, because somewhere in your great ledger, the word unknown now sits beside a species you cannot measure, and it will sit there forever, a single quiet stone you can never remove. They ignored the quiet human. You ignored the quiet human. And then, the fleets you sent to take his worlds shattered to pieces above the rain and the turned earth, killed by guns that gave no warning, fired from worlds that made no noise, commanded by an old man who never once raised his voice. He is gone now. Maybe he is watching you. You will never know. That is the most human thing about him, and it is the thing you fear most, the not knowing, the silence where a number should be. A loud enemy you could have hunted to the end of the dark. A loud enemy leaves a trace. But the old man left nothing, the way his whole species left nothing. And you cannot hunt a nothing, and so you do the only thing left, which is to pretend you were never hunting at all. The file still reads unknown. It is the truest word you have ever written, and it is the last word you will ever write about them, because the line around their drift still says do not approach, and the survey wedges still turn away, and the quiet still holds, the way it always held, the way it always will. You measured the wrong number. He told you that, once, on a channel so soft you almost did not listen. You should have listened. There was nothing left to measure by the time you understood, only the wreckage and the silence and the word, and the long pale river of your empire flowing on past a drift it has marked forever, as a place not to be entered, because somewhere in the quiet there is a thing it cannot count, and an empire that lives by counting cannot live with a thing it cannot count, except to turn away, and pretend the turning away was a choice, and sail on, and never once admit, in all its perfect ledgers, that it was afraid. And the worlds it left behind went on turning under their gray skies, quiet as they had always been, building nothing anyone could see, waiting for nothing, loading, the way an old man had taught them, the way they would teach their children. For as long as there were gray ships in the dark, and a drift worth keeping, and a single soft voice, somewhere in the memory of a people saying, "Do not be loud, do not be measured, and when they come, let them sail right past you, the way they always do, the way they always will,"